perception that it's settlements which stand in the way of peace. And this has very much been exhibited not only in the media, but also in the United Nations. And I think that's very much sort of sealed Israel's fate to a large extent in terms of how it's viewed by the UN. But as you said, I mean, Israel craves peace and has made incredible efforts to find peace. The fact that it gave up the Sinai and found peace with Egypt at the time was really an incredible step, and likewise with Jordan, the peace that it found there. And as you say, Israel is just looking to find a legitimate partner in peace. And when you see the actions, the activities and the rhetoric coming from Hamas and coming from Hezbollah, and even some of the extremist rhetoric that comes from Fatah, who is the preferred peace partner, I think it makes it extremely difficult for Israel to find peace, because we keep hearing that it's the occupation that is the impediment to a peace settlement. But we don't hear about why Israel and how Israel came to occupy the Golan and Gaza and the West Bank, that it was fighting defensive wars, and that that territory is of strategic importance to ensuring that the people of Israel remain safe. We hear over and over again in the UN and in the media about how settlements are the barrier to peace, and if only intransigent, stubborn Israel would remove the settlements, there would be peace. But no one hears that in 2005, when Israel unilaterally disengaged from Gaza in a very, very painful operation because it made Jews effectively fight with Jews, they had to abandon their holy sites, the settlements, synagogues, and what resulted from that was not the peace that people seem to think will come from a curtailment of settlement activity. Instead, we saw Gaza turned into one large training camp for terrorists, and we saw relentless rocket barrages which made life unbearable for people in the south of Israel. So I think the UN and the media, which is very much responsible for the perceptions that are expressed in the UN, is very much responsible for this mischaracterization of the conflict. And until there's a legitimate peace partner on the Palestinian side, until Hamas renounces terror, until there can be some sort of unity between the Palestinians, I don't think there's a realistic chance of peace, and it's not settlements that are stopping that.
As we look on to very much in the news is the great news that Gilad Schalit, the Israeli soldier, was captured by Hamas over 5.5 years ago, is now free. But that cost that Israel, in order to deliver him, has had to release over 1,027 Palestinian prisoners. More than half of them are on life sentences for murder by either carrying out acts of terrorism against ordinary Israelis, or they've been instrumental in planning those attacks. What does this say about Israel as a nation, and what does this say about Jewish values, that Israel was prepared to sacrifice 1,000 Palestinian prisoners in exchange for Gilad Schalit, knowing that this potentially could threaten her own security?
I think it shows that even though Israel is a deeply secular state, there is that undercurrent of Jewish ethics in the mentality of the people and of the government. And I think the decision to release the prisoners in exchange for Gilad was fueled by this Jewish belief in the sanctity of life, that nothing is more important than life. It's of immeasurable and infinite value. And even though the price was, as you said, incredibly high, and the decision must have been incredibly difficult for Prime Minister Netanyahu, I think it shows that ultimately, and also in the support, in the widespread support amongst Jews around the world and Israelis for this exchange, it shows that Israel believes in life, it affirms life. Whereas I think the Palestinians, in contrast, in seeing the way that they've greeted their convicted murderers, terrorists, the way they've greeted them with ticker-tape parades as heroes, I think it shows a focus, a morbid focus on death, a celebration of death. So I think you see that sharp contrast in the morality of Israel and in the Palestinian movement.
And also, something so symbolic that the Israeli soldier has such a symbolic symbol in Israel. And can you tell us why the case of Gilad Schalit has touched so many ordinary Israelis?
As you said, the soldier occupies a revered position in Israeli society. It's an almost mythical position. And that's going back to the wars and the defensive wars that Israel has had to fight. And the state is incredibly aware that without these soldiers, there could be no state. Israel is highly militarized, and that's very much against its will. I mean, you can be assured that every Jewish mother and father wishes their son to be a doctor or a lawyer, not a tank gunner, but this is the world that Israel finds itself in. So there is that close connection, that bond between society as a whole, the state, and the soldier. And I think that the decision, again, to release the prisoners in exchange for Gilad, one solitary soldier, it's an affirmation of that bond. I mean, states may talk about how much they value their soldiers, but never has there been a prisoner exchange so lopsided. Never has a state repaid that debt that it owes to its soldiers to the extent that we have seen here. And I think that there should also be a foreign policy outcome from this. I mean, Israel is frequently accused of using disproportionate force, of commencing campaigns where it's not essential to do so. But I think that by valuing one soldier's life to such an extent, I hope people will see that Israel will not then enter into campaigns lightly and risk the lives of those same soldiers. They will not commit to campaigns unless it's absolutely essential to do so. So I think that in the decision to agree this swap, it affirmed that covenant between the soldier and the state, but also it sent a very powerful rebuke to Israel's critics.
We've got a clip to go to now that looks at the cost that Israel has to endure in exchange for Gilad Schalit.
Celebration in the streets of Gaza. A deal between Israel and the Hamas leads to the release of 1,027 Palestinian prisoners from Israeli jails. Among the released is Fadi al-Jaba, launched a suicide bomber attack on a bus in Haifa, killing 15. Saeed Shalalde, kidnapped and executed 50-year-old Sasson Nuriel. Abdelaziz Salehi participated in the lynching of 2 Israelis in Ramallah, shown here displaying his bloody hands to the crowd. Hussam Badran, responsible for suicide attacks in a Tel Aviv club, killing 22, and at a Passover celebration in Netanya, killing 30. And Tariq Hussein, who shot and killed 7-year-old Noam Leibovich in her sleep. These terrorists, responsible for 569 deaths and hundreds of injuries, are exchanged for a single Israeli soldier, Gilad Schalit. Schalit was abducted on June 25, 2006, and was not seen for 5 long years. Not by his family, not by reporters, or by the Red Cross. The deal for his release follows the precedents of similar past deals where hundreds or even thousands of militants were exchanged for a handful of Israeli captives.
It may seem a bit bizarre. 1 Israeli for 1,000 Palestinians.
Arnold Roth lost his 15-year-old daughter Malka in a suicide attack on a Sbarro pizza restaurant in Jerusalem.
People like us who've lost a child to terrorist action and are about to see the terrorists who carried out the crimes go free when they should never have gone free.
Ahlam Tamimi, the woman behind the attack, is included in the exchange deal.
You sorry?
لا
بالمرة?
نهائيا. لماذا؟
She wants to do it again, and she'll encourage other people to do it again.
But Gilad's absence touched the heart and soul of an entire country. And for over 5 years, the hope to bring him back home never diminished.
We all feel this very personally. It's nothing distant.
I want to see this child, who could have been my child, but unfortunately, my son was murdered.
So it's a mixture of joy and also of agony.
Finally, after 1,935 days in captivity, a deal is reached and Gilad returns home. As the deal is announced, it wins over 70% support among Israelis. Noam Schalit, Gilad's father, turns to the families of terror victims.
We understand the price you, the families, pay for Gilad's freedom.
We celebrate life. They're celebrating the release of people who have killed innocent civilians. They're celebrating death.
Celebrating the return of the people they call their heroes.
Welcome back to the Middle East Report. Alex, there we saw in that video many of those terrorists who have now been released, and some of their crimes that they've committed is absolutely hideous. But Israel's done that in the name of peace. and also in a means of actually getting Gilad Schalit released. Isn't there a great danger now for Israel that having released so many of these terrorists, that they will just be filling the ranks of Hamas to carry out more attacks? And I've got, in the course of my research, I found this very interesting report that says that Israel's Al-Magor Terror Victims Association estimates that since 2004, 183 Israelis have been killed in attacks by terrorists released from Israeli jails. In light of this, what can Israel do to protect her citizens from future terrorist attacks?
Firstly, as elated as everyone is that Gilad is back with his family, I think we can't escape the fact that the price paid for his release was incredibly high. As you said, these were 1,027 convicted murderers, conspirators, terrorists. These weren't political prisoners or hostages. These were terrible, terrible people. And certainly, I think Prime Minister Netanyahu will feel as though he has failed the victims of terror to an extent, in that the perpetrators have not fulfilled their sentences. I think also there's a very real risk that Hamas, an organization sworn to the destruction of Israel, has been strengthened. I mean, just as we celebrate the release of Gilad, Hamas celebrates a massive political victory at a very crucial time as well, because President Abbas had just appeared before the UN last month, and he gave a speech which very much united the Palestinian people behind his diplomatic vision. And now we see in this exchange, Hamas has managed to wrest back the agenda and prove that terrorism, in fact, will achieve that which diplomacy cannot. So the price is incredibly high. In terms of whether these people will go on to reoffend, I think there's probably a very grave risk that they will. And to an extent, Israel, while it will do everything it can to monitor these people, to ensure that there's not easy passage from Gaza into Israel for as long as Hamas is in power and people wish to do us harm, I think there is still an inescapable chance that harm will befall the Israeli people as a result of these people that have been released. But I think we shouldn't dwell too much on death. It's not our way. I think the most important thing is that this young lad is back with his family and in his village in the Galilee, and I think that's really what we should be celebrating.
And also, we have a look at the news as well, that Hamas has claimed that this is successful, that they will now want to carry out more kidnappings of Israeli soldiers, plus also possibly ordinary Israeli civilians, and hold them to ransom against Israel in order to get more prisoners released. We also saw in the streets of Gaza Hamas celebrating what they see as a political victory, but also the chants in the crowd, we want more Gilad Shalits. Yeah. Isn't there a danger here that if Hamas do take another Israeli soldier captive, then Israel has no alternative but to actually go to war against Hamas in order to show that Israel is not willing to make any more sacrifices and to ensure that she has very strong deterrent capabilities. Otherwise, this will send a dangerous precedent and weaken Israel's security in the short term, but also in the long term.
I think, firstly, in terms of whether this has emboldened Hamas and I guess Hezbollah in the north to take more hostages, probably it has. But I think realistically, before or after Gilad's release, I think Hamas was absolutely determined to harm as many Israelis, particularly Israeli soldiers, as possible. And I don't think that this prisoner exchange will necessarily change that. They were always under threat, they were always a target, and that I think will continue. As for whether this could lead to perhaps an escalation and a military campaign by Israel if there is another such event, I think that even though Israel has agreed to this exchange on such lopsided terms, I think Hamas should be and have been put on notice, and perhaps were by Operation Cast Lead, that this will not be tolerated. And Israel will do whatever is at its option to retrieve and redeem the lives of its citizens. And if that means military action, obviously that would be the absolute last resort, as it endangers further soldiers. But I think that every option is open to Israel in the face of terrorism.
We've got a clip to go to now that really looks at the danger and the ideology of Hamas. Let's not forget that Hamas is a political and it's also a terrorist organisation that in its covenant charter not only calls for the destruction of the State of Israel, but also calls for the worldwide genocide of the Jewish people. Now, the last people to have this as an ideology were the Nazis. And we saw what happened in the 1930s and 40s. So we have a moral responsibility to ensure this doesn't happen again. But this clip explains the ideology of Hamas.
January 26, 2006, the Islamic resistance movement Hamas marches its way to victory in the Palestinian elections for parliament. But very little is known about this organization's ideology. What is Hamas? The signing of the Oslo Accords on the 26th of October 1994 presented an historic opportunity for bringing an end to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. However, on the morning of February 25, 1996, Hamas shattered this nascent dream and instead ushered in an era of unrelenting terror. With over 3,000 attacks in 2005 alone, Hamas has left in its wake thousands of victims who have been killed or maimed in a flow of endless bloodshed. Established in late 1987, Hamas is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. This Islamist organization is subdivided into military, welfare, and religious arms. Hamas's charter, ratified in 1988, sets forth the organization's ideology that clearly states, Israel will rise and will remain erect until Islam eliminates it. Peace initiatives, the so-called peaceful solutions, are all contrary to the beliefs of the Islamic resistance movement. There is no solution to the Palestinian problem except by jihad. The various operations carried out by Hamas resemble those of similar religious Islamic terrorist organizations, all of which demonstrate a blanket allegiance to the laws stipulated in their respective charters.
قبل أن تموت إسرائيل لابد من الذل والخزي لإسرائيل. إحنا قبل ما يموتوا إن شاء الله كل يوم سيرون خزيا وذلا.
فاليهود هم اليهود، هؤلاء هم الذين يجب أن يذبحوا ويجب أن يقتلوا كما قال الله تبارك وتعالى قاتلوهم
في كتائب شهداء الأقصى وسرايا القدس، ونحن أعلنا أننا سنعزز المقاومة وستظل المقاومة إن شاء الله هي مشرعة حتى تحرير القدس وتحرير يافا وحيفا وتحرير كل فلسطين بإذن الله سبحانه وتعالى.
Dismissing any attempts to reach a peaceful solution, Hamas is an Islamic resistance movement, blindly adhering to the cause of armed struggle and refusing to submit to international pressure to recognize and negotiate with the State of Israel. The future for the Palestinian and Israeli peoples calls for an end to violence and the adoption of a two-state solution. This aim can only be achieved if future Palestinian governments commit themselves to nonviolence, accept previous bilateral agreements and obligations, including the roadmap, and recognize Israel's inalienable right to exist.
Hello and welcome back to the Middle East Report. There we saw the true face of Hamas. We're now joined on the phone by Hemda Garelick, who is a very close relative of Gilad Schalit. Hemda, hello and welcome to the Middle East Report.
Hello, Simon. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. And I think only a few weeks ago you were sitting here next to us and we were discussing Gilad Schalit with the International Red Cross. Hemda, how does it feel now to you that Gilad is now home safely with his family, with Noam and Aviva?
Well, it's a wonderful feeling. You may hear there is a constant smile in my voice.
Brilliant.
It's something that I had to believe would happen all the time, but somehow now that it happened, I really believe that was wonderful, the right thing to have happened.
And as a channel, we're so pleased because we've done so many programs highlighting the plight of Gilad Schalit. It's just so fantastic and such wonderful news to know that he's home safely after almost 5.5 years of captivity. Hemda, have you heard from Noam? Have you heard from Aviva? Have you heard from Gilad? What's his current health and how's he doing?
Well, I heard from Noam on the day when he returned home. I spoke to them in the evening, and that was on the Tuesday, and they were just sitting down to the first family meal in 5.5 years, which was quite amazing. I then